The day I paid $12 for 40 acres of land, the county clerk looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I was 16 years old, standing at that counter in mud-caked boots that were 2 sizes too big, my entire life packed into a canvas duffel bag sitting on the floor beside my feet. She slid the receipt across the counter without a word, and I remember thinking, this is either the best decision I've ever made or the last one I'll be allowed to make for a long time. Nobody wanted those 40 acres. That was the thing everyone in the county agreed on. They called it the back hollow. 40 acres of rocky, overgrown bottomland that sat at the lowest point of my grandfather's old property, cut off from the main road by a creek that flooded every spring, and a tree line so dense you could lose a man in it by noon. For as long as anyone could remember, it had been the part of Earl Sutton's land that nobody talked about, not worth farming, not worth selling, just sitting there at the edge of everything, doing nothing, being nothing. That's what they told me. Anyway, what they didn't tell me, what they didn't know, was that my grandfather had spent the last 20 years of his life burying something in that hollow. Not gold, not cash, though what he left was worth more than either. He buried the truth down there. He buried the future. He buried in the soil and the stone and the county records and the sealed strongbox beneath the old smokehouse floor, and he buried it carefully, deliberately, in a way that only one person was ever meant to find. Me. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. This is a story about land and silence, and what a man hides when he loves someone more than he can say. My grandfather Earl Sutton was not a man who explained himself. He was the kind of man who showed up. He showed up before dawn when the creek was flooding the lower fence line. He showed up in August when the hay baler broke down and 3 other families needed their fields cut before the rain came. He showed up at funerals and barn raisings and at the edge of his own property every single morning of his adult life, walking the fence line with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on the ground, reading the land the way other men read newspapers. I know this because I walked with him. From the time I was old enough to keep up with his long, slow stride, I walked that property beside him, not because anyone told me to, not because it was required, but because, out of everyone in our family, I was the only one who wanted to. My father died when I was 9, a farming accident, the kind that happens fast and leaves slowly. After that, it was just me and my grandfather for a while, living in the old farmhouse on the main parcel of his land, 180 acres in the hill country of eastern Kentucky. My grandfather never remarried. He cooked badly and kept the house in that particular kind of disorder that belongs only to men who live alone. But he was steady and he was present, and every morning when I came downstairs, he was already at the table with coffee and a purpose. Then, when I was 11, my father's older brother, my Uncle Raymond, moved back from Cincinnati with his wife Diane and her son Marcus. Raymond had been in and out of our lives the way a bad season comes in and out, without apology, without warning. He'd left Kentucky at 19 and come back at 43 with less money than he'd left with and more opinions about everything. He and my grandfather had a complicated history. But Earl Sutton was not the kind of man to turn family away. And so Raymond and Diane and Marcus moved into the east wing of the farmhouse. And just like that, the balance of everything shifted. Diane was not a cruel woman, in the way that cruelty announces itself. She was a subtler kind. She had a way of rearranging the meaning of things, of reframing what was already settled. Within 6 months of moving in, she had reframed my position in that household from grandson, an heir to an inconvenience, a dependent, a child who wasn't really theirs and whose future was, in her words, not their responsibility to fund. Marcus was 3 years older than me and had learned from his mother that the fastest way to feel tall was to make someone else feel small. He had my grandfather's land appraised within a year of moving in, not because anyone asked him to, just because he wanted to know what things were worth. He came back from that meeting at the county office with printouts and a smug expression and announced at dinner that the main 140 acres were worth more than anyone had realized. My grandfather said nothing. He ate his supper and excused himself early. Later that night, I found him on the back porch. He was sitting in his chair, looking out toward the dark line of trees at the edge of the property. I sat down next to him. We were quiet for a long time, the way we often were, in the particular companionship that doesn't need words. After a while, he said, "Caleb, do you know what makes land worth something?" I said I didn't. He was quiet again. Then, "What's on the surface? That's what people see. What's underneath? That's what lasts." I didn't fully understand what he meant. I was 12 years old, and I thought he was talking about soil composition, about the limestone bedrock that ran beneath the property, which he had explained to me once on one of our fence-line walks. I nodded like I understood, and he patted my shoulder once, and we went inside. It was only years later that I understood he wasn't talking about limestone at all. In the years after that conversation, my grandfather and I continued to walk the property together, and each morning we went a little further, a little deeper, and he told me things that I didn't understand were lessons until much later. He showed me where the water table sat close to the surface in dry years. He showed me the limestone outcroppings along the eastern ridge and described what they told him about what lay beneath. He walked me through the back hollow on a Sunday afternoon in the fall of my 13th year, and he stood at the edge of the old stone smokehouse there, a building that had been in use since before I was born, and he looked at it the way he looked at the fence line in the morning, like a man who sees something others have stopped bothering to see. "Your great-grandfather built that," he said. It was all he said. I understood now that he was leaving me breadcrumbs. He was building a map in my head, one walk at a time, so that when the moment came and the document in the metal box confirmed it, I would already know the territory. He was not just leaving me land. He was leaving me the knowledge of it. The community around our farm knew Earl Sutton, the way rural communities know their anchor people, the name that shows up when something needs doing, the man who has always been there, and whose presence has become as much a part of the landscape as the ridge behind the property. Our neighbor Abe Wheeler, who ran the adjacent parcel and had worked alongside my grandfather since before my father was born, once told me that Earl Sutton was the most trusted man in the county because he had never told anyone what they wanted to hear at the expense of what was true. Inside the family, the story was different. To Raymond, my grandfather was an obligation fulfilled, a dutiful son who had helped out by providing housing, even if he had his own eccentric habits about the land. To Diane, he was an aging farmer sitting on assets that were being mismanaged by sentiment. To Marcus, he was simply the old man who owned the property Marcus planned to inherit through Raymond, a stepping stone to a profitable sale. None of them walked the fence line with him. Not once. In 4 years of living on his land, did any of them get up early enough to walk beside him while he read the land the way he read it every morning. That absence told him everything he needed to know, and it is what decided, long before anyone knew a decision was being made, where the truth would go. My grandfather Earl died on a Tuesday morning in late October, 3 weeks after his 71st birthday. He had a heart attack in the barn, alone, before anyone else was awake. I was the one who found him, because I was the one who was always up early enough to be there. He looked peaceful. His hands were folded in his lap, the way he sometimes sat when he was thinking. I was 15 years old, and in that moment, kneeling on the cold barn floor, I understood that everything was about to change. I was right. The will reading happened 10 days after the funeral, in the front room of the farmhouse, around the kitchen table that had belonged to my great-grandmother. The attorney was a man named Griggs, young, uncomfortable, clearly hoping to get through the appointment without incident. He didn't get his wish. My grandfather's will was a document that Diane had somehow learned about in advance. I understood this later. She had gotten friendly with the secretary at Griggs' office over the preceding year, which was no accident. She knew the broad strokes before anyone sat down, and she had used those months to prepare. The will left the main farmhouse and the primary 140 acres to Raymond. This was expected. Raymond was my grandfather's son, his blood, and whatever their complications, Earl Sutton believed in keeping land in the family name. My grandfather had provided separately for the continuation of the farm's operation, equipment, an operating account, the lease agreements with neighboring farms. What the will also said in plain language was that the back hollow, the 40 acres of bottomland at the property's lowest corner, was to pass to me, to Caleb James Sutton, grandson, upon his 18th birthday, or earlier if he chose to claim it by paying the accumulated back taxes, which at the time of drafting amounted to less than $15. I didn't know this yet. Griggs was still reading. Diane knew it, though. And when Griggs got to that paragraph, something moved across her face. Something quiet and calculated. She had not expected this. The 40 acres had always been written off. Worthless land, bad drainage, no road access, good for nothing. She had not considered it worth fighting over. But she did not like that it was going to me. 40 acres of swamp, Marcus said, with a short laugh that he aimed at the far wall. He was 18, sitting back in his chair with the comfortable posture of someone who had already won. That's generous. Raymond said nothing. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. My grandfather had also left me a personal item, his pocket watch, which had been his own grandfather's, and a single sealed envelope with my name on it in his handwriting, to be given to me privately. Griggs handed it over. I put it in my jacket pocket. Diane's eyes followed it the way a hawk watches a field mouse. After the reading, I went upstairs. I sat on my bed and opened the envelope. There was no letter inside. There was only a hand-drawn map. It showed the 40 acres of the back hollow in careful, precise lines. In the bottom corner of the map, near the old stone smokehouse that sat at the property's lowest point, there was an X. Below the X, in my grandfather's handwriting, 3 words. Look beneath the floor, not the top stone, the one underneath. I held the paper for a long time. Then I heard Diane's voice in the hallway, speaking to Raymond in particular low register she used when she was making decisions for him. The boy can take the swampland. It'll keep him occupied. But he's not staying in this house past his birthday. Raymond, I mean it. He's not our child. He's not our responsibility. I folded the map. I put it back in my pocket. 3 weeks later, just before my 16th birthday, Diane informed me that arrangements had been made for me to stay with a family 2 towns over. People I didn't know, a distant connection of Raymond's. I had a week to gather my things. I didn't argue. My grandfather had taught me something about when not to speak. But before the will reading, there had been a gathering, a sort of family accounting, Diane called it, held at the farmhouse, at that same kitchen table. Raymond's sister drove up from Tennessee. A cousin from Louisville came. It was framed as a family dinner, a gathering of people who'd loved Earl Sutton and wanted to talk about how to honor his memory. What it actually was, I understood only gradually as the evening went on, was a conversation about what to do about me. I sat at that table. I was the youngest person in the room by 20 years, and I was the only one without a settled look on my face. Diane set the frame early. She spoke warmly about Earl. She'd gotten better at warmth once he was no longer around to notice its artificiality. She spoke about how much he'd given to this family, how important it was to make responsible decisions going forward. Caleb is a good boy, she said, and the way she said it made it clear that being a good boy was a kind of limitation, like being a good pet. But he's not a farmer. He's 16. He's got his whole future ahead of him. The land he inherited, well... She paused. Let the pause do the work. 40 acres of back hollow isn't going to make anyone's fortune. Raymond's sister nodded. The cousin from Louisville, who had been to property exactly once as a child and remembered nothing about it, agreed with the authority of someone who had no stake and no information. Maybe it makes more sense, Diane continued, if Caleb lets Raymond manage the whole parcel together. Cleaner, more efficient. Raymond can give him something for it when he turns 18. A reasonable something. She was asking me to sign away my grandfather's bequest. She was asking me to do it at a table surrounded by adults who had already decided, while making it sound like a favor. I looked across the table at Marcus. He was watching me with that particular expression he'd worn for 5 years, the look of someone who already knows how the story ends. I said, I appreciate everyone's concern. I'll think about it. I did not agree. I did not sign anything, but I also did not reveal what I knew or what I was planning. My grandfather had taught me that the moment you show your hand is the moment you've already played it. What I remember most is the car ride afterward, sitting in the back of Raymond's truck while he drove me back to the house. He was quiet the whole way. When we pulled up to the farmhouse, before I got out, he said, without looking at me, she means, well, Caleb. She's just practical. I got out without answering. I went upstairs and looked at the map again. The next morning, I walked the fence line alone for the first time. It was mine now, or would be. I stood at the edge of the back hollow and looked down into it. The dense tree cover, the frozen creek at the bottom, the dark shape of the old stone smokehouse barely visible through the brush. An old man named Abe Wheeler lived on property adjacent to the back hollow, a former farmhand who'd worked for my grandfather for 30 years. He was standing at his fence line when I came down the hill, watching me approach with the careful eyes of a man who understood what he was seeing. "Paying your respects?" he said. "Getting acquainted," I said. He looked out over the hollow. After a while, he said, "Your granddaddy spent a lot of time down there in his last years, more than people knew." I asked him what he meant. He was quiet for a while. Then, "Earl Sutton was a careful man, deliberate. He didn't do things without a reason." He looked at me with the directness of someone who has decided to trust you. Whatever reason he had for spending time down there, whatever he was doing in that old smokehouse, it wasn't nothing. I can tell you that. He turned and went back toward his house. Then he stopped and looked back. "That hollow's always been called worthless. Earl never called it worthless. Not once, in 30 years of working beside him." He paused. "You might want to think about why." I stood there at the fence line in the cold, with the hollow below me and the dead weight of everyone's dismissal at my back, and I let myself believe, fully, for the first time, that my grandfather had left me something real. I packed my duffel bag. I took the envelope. I took the pocket watch. I took the worn-out work boots that had been his. And on a gray November morning, I walked to the county office, slid $12.47 across the counter in backed-up tax payments, and claimed 40 acres of land that everyone in the county agreed was worthless. I was 16 years old, homeless, and the owner of a flooded bottomland hollow with no road access and a collapsed old smokehouse at its edge. I had never felt more purposeful in my life. If this story is moving you, hit the like button and turn on the bell so you never miss another story like this one. I moved into the hollow on the first day of December. There was no house. There was no road. There was a collapsed smokehouse, a partial stone foundation that may have been a structure once, and 40 acres of bottomland that nobody wanted. I built a shelter the first week from salvaged lumber I carried in piece by piece from a demolished equipment shed on the edge of the main property that Raymond had said I could take from. It wasn't warm, but it was 4 walls and a roof, and I'd been warm my whole life. I could learn not to be for a while. I didn't have electricity. I didn't have running water. I had a creek that ran clean in winter when the runoff wasn't heavy, a camp stove I bought with the last of the cash I had saved, 2 blankets, and the map. The map was the thing I kept coming back to. On my 4th day in the hollow, I went to the smokehouse. It had partially collapsed. The roof had come in on one side, and the eastern wall had buckled outward from decades of water pressure and root growth. But the stone floor was intact. The smokehouse had been built on bedrock, the way old-timers built things when they were building for keeps. My grandfather had understood the permanence of stone. I moved debris for 6 hours. I pulled rotted timber and collapsed roofing and years of accumulated leaf matter off the floor until I had the stones exposed. They were flat limestone flags, fitted together so tightly that grass hadn't been able to grow between them. Then I found it, in the corner nearest the collapsed wall. There was one stone that sat slightly lower than the others. Not noticeably, not unless you were looking, and looking carefully, with your hands as much as your eyes. My grandfather's note had said, "Not the top stone, the one underneath." I used a tire iron I brought with me as a lever and pried the top stone up. Beneath it was a second stone, smaller, set into a deliberate pocket in the bedrock. It was sealed around the edges with what looked like roofing tar, applied carefully, thoroughly, the work of a man who was thinking about water intrusion and moisture in time. I broke the seal with the flat edge of the tire iron and lifted the second stone. Below it was a metal box, military surplus, olive green, the kind they made in the 50s to survive things that weren't supposed to be survived. It had 2 heavy latches and a combination lock. My grandfather had sent me the map. He had shown me the stone. He had trusted me to know the combination. I sat there for a moment, thinking about it. Then I tried the most obvious thing, the date my father was born. My father, who Earl Sutton had loved more than anything in the world, and whose death he had never recovered from. The dials turned. The lock released. I lifted the lid. Inside, packed in layers of oilskin cloth that had kept everything bone dry despite the years and the ground moisture, was a collection of documents that would take me 2 full days to fully read and understand. The first thing I recognized was a mineral rights lease, a 70-year lease registered with the county in 1987, before I was born. It covered the full 40 acres of the back hollow, and it was registered in the name of Earl Sutton, with a designated heir listed as Caleb James Sutton, only son of Thomas James Sutton. The lease had been negotiated with Regional Gas Exploration Company. My grandfather had identified what geologists call a natural gas formation, a pocket of methane trapped in the limestone beneath the hollow, in the early 1980s, when a company had done speculative drilling in the surrounding county. He had quietly, without telling anyone, hired an independent geologist to assess his land. When that assessment came back, confirming the formation extended on the back hollow, he had done something extraordinary. He had registered the mineral rights separately from the surface rights of the property. This is legal. It is not complicated. It is something that sophisticated landowners do and that most farm families never consider, because most farm families don't think about what's under the ground. When Raymond inherited the surface land, he inherited exactly that, the surface, what lay beneath the back hollow. The gas formation, the extraction rights, the lease income, was never his. It was mine. But that was not all. The second document was a water easement deed. It had been registered in 1991, also quietly, also at the county office, and it documented a natural spring on the back hollow property that was a primary source for a watershed that fed both the main farm property and 3 adjacent parcels. The easement deed, which my grandfather had filed correctly and completely, established that any disruption of that water source required the written consent of the easement holder. The easement holder was me, which meant that Raymond and Diane's plan to develop the main farm property, to sell it back 80 acres to a developer, which I had heard them discussing through a farmhouse wall 2 weeks before I moved out, required my signature. They did not know that. The third document was a surveyor's report, dated 1994, commissioned by my grandfather from a licensed surveyor named Dale Mercer, operating out of the county seat. The report documented the property lines of the full original parcel, the 180 acres Earl Sutton had inherited from his own father. The survey revealed something that the existing county records did not reflect. The official county plat map showed the back hollow as 40 acres, but the actual surveyed boundary, running along a natural limestone ridge that formed the eastern edge of the hollow, was 57 acres. 17 acres had been misrecorded in the county system in 1962, before my grandfather had inherited the land. A clerical error, a transposition of survey markers. The kind of mistake that happens once and calcifies into official record and is never corrected because no one ever looks closely enough. My grandfather had looked closely. He had commissioned the survey, confirmed the error, and then, deliberately, carefully, done nothing to correct it publicly. He had documented it. He had preserved the documentation, and he had left it for me. I sat in that collapsed smokehouse for a long time after I finished reading. The winter light was coming to the gap in the roof at a late afternoon angle, falling across the document spread on the stone floor around me, and I thought about a man who had walked this hollow for 30 years, knowing what was under it, knowing what it was worth, knowing who it was for, and who had never once said a word. He had trusted me to find it. I picked up the last item in the box. It was a letter, handwritten, undated, on the thin, pale blue paper my grandfather used for correspondence. Caleb, if you are reading this, you found the stone. That means you are still the same boy I walked the fence line with, the one who pays attention, who listens to the land. That's all I ever needed you to be. The mineral lease will begin generating income when the gas company exercises its option, and they will, within the next 10 years, based on regional exploration patterns. The water easement is clean and registered, and requires no action from you unless someone tries to develop the upper land without your consent. The survey correction is straightforward to file. Mercer is still practicing, and his son is now a surveyor as well. Either of them can help you. I did not tell your uncle or his wife about any of this. I thought about it. I decided that what you have is worth more as a quiet truth than as a loud argument. Let them take what they can see. What matters has always been what you can't see on the surface. You are your father's son. You are mine. Whatever they told you about this land, about yourself, it is not true. The hollow was never worthless. Neither were you. Earl, I folded the letter. I put it in my pocket, where the map had been. Then I put every document back in the oilskin, sealed the box, and began to think. I spent the next 3 weeks quietly and carefully. I did not go to the county office yet. I did not call an attorney. I did not say a word to anyone in Raymond's household. What I did was go to Abe Wheeler. Abe Wheeler was 74 years old, had worked this land since he was younger than I was, and had the kind of knowledge that comes from paying attention over a very long time. He also had a working telephone, a warm kitchen, and the good sense not to ask questions he hadn't been invited to ask. I showed him the documents. All of them. He read every page, slowly and carefully, the way you read something when you're deciding whether to believe it. When he was finished, he set the papers on the table and looked at me for a long moment. You know what this is, he said. It wasn't a question. I think so, I said. Your granddaddy was a patient man, he said. Probably the most patient man I ever knew. He was quiet for a moment. He talked about you, even when you were small. He used to say, that boy sees what's there, not just what's in front of him. He nodded slowly. He was right. Abe knew a retired attorney in the county seat, a man named Frank Coble who had done land and estate work for 40 years before retiring. He made a call. Frank Coble came out to the hollow 2 days later in his truck and walked the property with me and Abe while I explained what I found. Coble was a compact man with a white mustache and the manner of someone who had spent a long professional life watching people lie to each other about land. He asked precise questions and made no expressions while I answered them. He read every document. He took notes in a small leather notebook. He asked to see the box in the stone and the sealed pocket in the smokehouse floor. When he was done, he stood up straight and looked at me with the steady assessment of a man who had just determined that what he was looking at was real. The mineral lease is valid, properly registered, and unambiguous, he said. The gas formation in this hollow has been identified in recent regional surveys. There's been active exploration interest in this county for the past 2 years. The company with the original lease has successors who will be bound by its terms. You're sitting on a producing asset. He paused. The water easement is clean. It is registered. If anyone attempts to develop the upper parcel without your consent and without addressing the watershed impact, they're in violation. Given that I believe Raymond Sutton has been in preliminary conversations with a developer about the back 80 acres of the upper parcel, this is immediately relevant. Another pause. The survey error is correctable through a standard filing with the county office and the state survey board. It will add 17 acres to your registered title. He looked at me steadily. Combined with the gas formation and the water easement, your 40, or rather 57, acres of worthless bottomland is worth considerably more than the 140 acres of surface farmland above it. He said a number. I won't repeat it here because numbers are the least important part of this story. But it was a number that made my hands shake slightly. What do you want to do? He said. I had been thinking about this for 3 weeks. I knew my answer. I want to do it correctly, I said. Legally, in front of the right people. I want the record to be clear. He nodded once, like I confirmed something he'd suspected. Good. Then here's what we do. The meeting was requested through Coble's office. A letter went to Raymond, signed by Frank Coble, requesting a meeting at the county courthouse regarding an estate matter related to the late Earl Ray Sutton's property. The letter was formal and revealed nothing specific. It mentioned that the matter involved mineral rights, easement deeds, and a survey discrepancy, and that it required the presence of all parties with a legal interest in the Sutton land parcels. I learned later that Diane had laughed when Raymond showed her the letter. Mineral rights on the back swamp, she'd told him. The boy found something and thinks it's a gold mine. Just go and let them explain why it's nothing. Marcus came too. That was his choice. The courthouse meeting room was small, a long table, 6 chairs, pale winter light coming through windows that needed washing. Coble sat on one side with me and Abe Wheeler, who had insisted on being present as a witness. Raymond and Diane and Marcus sat across from us. Raymond's expression was the careful neutrality of a man trying to look like he hadn't already made up his mind. Diane's was a particular brightness of someone who had prepared for a negotiation she's certain she'll win. Marcus leaned back in his chair. A county official, a woman named Patricia Lund, from the Property Records Office, was also there, at Coble's request, with copies of all relevant county filings. Coble set the documents on the table in a specific order. He was a man who understood that the sequence of a revelation matters as much as its content. He started with the survey. He explained calmly and with precision the 1962 clerical error in the county plat records. He showed the original 1994 survey commissioned by Earl Sutton. He showed the discrepancy between the official record and the actual boundary. 40 acres in the county system, 57 on the ground. He noted that a corrective filing had already been submitted to the county office that morning. He had done it before this meeting, and that Patricia Lund was present to confirm its receipt and validity. Diane's expression didn't change. A survey correction was a minor thing in isolation. She didn't see where this was going. Then Coble set the mineral rights lease on the table. He explained what it was. He explained when it had been registered. He explained the legal distinction between surface rights and mineral rights, that when a landowner separates and registers mineral rights independently, a subsequent transfer of the surface land does not carry those rights. He explained that Raymond's inheritance of the surface land could never have included, the mineral rights, which had been separately and correctly registered to Earl Sutton personally, with Caleb James Sutton designated as heir. He placed a regional exploration survey on the table beside it, the one identifying active gas exploration interests in the county, including a specific reference to the limestone formation underlying the back hollow, the formation my grandfather had known about since 1982. He named the projected figure for the initial lease option period. Diane's brightness dimmed, not all at once, in degrees. She looked at Raymond. Raymond was very still. Marcus had stopped leaning back. Then Coble placed the water easement deed on the table. He explained the spring. He explained the watershed. He explained what the easement required. He explained that a development sale of the back 80 acres of the upper parcel, and here he looked at Diane with the quiet, steady directness of a man who has done his research, would require the written consent of the easement holder. He set one final document on the table, a letter sent 3 months prior from a regional development company to Raymond Sutton, outlining preliminary terms for the purchase of the back 80 acres, a copy that had reached Coble through entirely legal means. The room was absolutely silent. Patricia Lund, the county official, was looking at the documents with a careful, neutral expression of someone watching a story resolve itself correctly. Diane set her hands flat on the table. I watched her do it. Watched her impose stillness on herself the way you impose stillness on a physical reflex. When she had been dismissed from all of her assumptions about this land, when everything she had written off as worthless had been placed in front of her as the most valuable thing in the county, she did not shout. She did not stand up. She went quiet in the way that means a great deal of thinking is happening very fast. This can be challenged, she said. Finally, her voice was controlled. Barely. It can be, Coble said. You're welcome to consult your own attorney. What you'll find is that the mineral lease was registered in full compliance with Kentucky property law as it stood in 1987 and has remained valid under every subsequent revision. The water easement was similarly registered correctly. The survey correction is a standard clerical remedy with no discretionary component. There is nothing to challenge. He paused. What there is, he continued, is a decision to make. Marcus was the first one to speak after that pause. What he said was not what I expected. How long did he know? He said. His voice was different from the way it usually was. The performance of ease gone, replaced by something rawer. He was looking at the documents, not at me. About the gas formation? Probably since the early 80s. I said. He hired a geologist. He was careful about it. And he never said anything. It wasn't a question. No. Marcus was quiet for a while. Then he let us think it was worthless. He let everyone think it was worthless. I said. He didn't pick a side. He just arranged the truth. Something crossed Marcus's face that I hadn't seen there before. He was 21 now, in his third year of a business degree at a state college, and he had spent 5 years performing the confidence of someone who had already figured out how everything worked. In that moment, sitting across from me in that courthouse meeting room, that performance simply wasn't there. He looked down at the table. Diane had gone somewhere inside herself. You could see it, the withdrawal, the recalibration. She was not a person who broke easily, and she did not break now in the way people break in dramatic moments, with tears or shouting. She went still and inward, and when she spoke again, her voice was measured. "What do you want, Caleb?" I had thought about this for 3 weeks. I had talked about it with Abe Wheeler on his porch in the cold, with Frank Coble in his retired attorney's living room, and with myself walking the fence line of the back hollow in the mornings, thinking through what my grandfather would have wanted. My grandfather was not a vengeful man. He had never been. He had arranged the truth, not as a weapon, but as a gift that was also protection, a way of ensuring that the person who stayed was also the person who was secure. He had not buried those documents to destroy Raymond. He had buried them so that I would have something to stand on when I needed to stand. I want the development sale of the upper parcel stopped until a proper environmental assessment of the watershed impact is completed. I said, "That's the easement. That's the law." Diane nodded very carefully. "I want the mineral lease honored under its original terms. I'm willing to work with the gas company directly on the timeline. I'm not in a hurry, but I want it documented clearly that any income from that formation belongs to the registered heir." Another nod. "I want the survey correction filed," which it already is, "and I want the title updated to reflect the true 57 acres. Raymond said for the first time, "That's all?" I looked at him. He was a man who had come back from Cincinnati, having lost something he hadn't named, and was still trying to figure out what it was. He had let Diane lead because he didn't know how to lead himself, and I understood that. I didn't like it, but I understood it. "That's the legal part," I said. "There's one more thing." I looked at Diane. "I want it clearly stated, among this family, in writing if necessary, that the back hollow was never worthless, that my grandfather knew what it was, and that he left it to me deliberately, not as an afterthought, not as a consolation." Diane looked at me for a long time. Something moved behind her eyes, something I hadn't expected to see there, which was something like recognition. The recognition of someone who has spent years being very certain about what other people are worth, and has just been shown, in irrefutable documentary form, the cost of that certainty. She said, "He was smarter than I gave him credit for." It was not an apology. Diane was not a person who apologized, but it was the closest she had ever come to acknowledging that she had underestimated something, and in its way, it was enough. What happened with Marcus? That took longer, and that was more important. After the formal meeting ended and the documents were filed and Raymond and Diane had left, Marcus stayed behind. He sat at the table after everyone else had gone, and I sat across from him, and Abe Wheeler sat at the end of the table with a cup of bad coffee from the courthouse machine. "He walked the fence line with you," Marcus said. "Every morning." "Most mornings," I said. "He never walked it with me." He said it without self-pity as a statement of fact. "I lived in that house for 4 years. He never once asked me to walk the fence line. I didn't say anything to that, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have been either cruel or dishonest, and Marcus deserved neither. I used to think it was because you were his real family," he said, "his blood, and we were just Raymond's wife and her kid." He paused. "But sitting here, reading how long he planned this, how carefully, I think maybe it wasn't about blood at all. I think he just knew who was paying attention." He looked at me directly. I wasn't paying attention. I was looking at the appraisal numbers. "You were 18, I said. "So were you?" "Essentially." I shook my head. "I was 12 when I started walking the fence line with him. I was 9 when my father died, and he was the one who got up early to make sure I had someone to eat breakfast with." I let that settle. He didn't choose me because of blood. He chose me because I showed up. Marcus was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I've been a lousy person to you." "Yes," I said. "I'm sorry." I looked at him. He meant it. I could see that he meant it. And that meaning it cost him something real. Because Marcus had spent 5 years being a person who didn't apologize and wasn't wrong about things. And both of those were gone now. "I know," I said. "I accept that." We shook hands across the table. It wasn't the end of anything complicated, but it was the beginning of something different. The spring came early that year. By March, the creek at the bottom of the back hollow was running clear and strong, fed by snowmelt from the ridge above. The hollow, which everyone called worthless and abandoned, was actually extraordinarily alive. The bottomland soil was deep and dark, sheltered from wind by the ridge, fed by the spring, rich with decades of undisturbed organic matter. Birds I couldn't name were in the trees. The limestone shelves at the edge of the creek held small pools full of things I had to look up in a field guide. I had spent the winter months reading everything I could find about natural gas extraction, water rights law, and ecological land management. Frank Coble had connected me with the successor company to the original leaseholder, a regional energy firm that had been watching the county's gas formation for 2 years and was ready to exercise the option. The conversations were straightforward. The lease terms were binding, the formation was confirmed, and they were ready to begin. I was not in a hurry, as I had said. I told them I wanted the extraction process designed with the watershed protection as a primary constraint, that the spring and the water table were not negotiable. They agreed, because the lease required them to agree, and because the projected value of the formation made constraints worth accepting. I also called Dale Mercer's son, the surveyor, and had a full walk of the newly corrected 57 acres. What I found was that my grandfather had understood every inch of it. The additional 17 acres included a section of hardwood forest along the eastern ridge that had been growing undisturbed for at least 60 years. Timber of real value, capable of being managed carefully over time. It also included a section of naturally flat land above the spring that my grandfather had, at some point, quietly cleared of brush, though the clearing wasn't visible from the road or from the upper farm. It was as if he had laid a foundation and walked away, knowing someone would come to build on it. I built there. It took most of the spring and part of the summer. With Abe Wheeler's help and the help of 2 men he knew who did honest construction work for fair wages. A small house, nothing elaborate, nothing I didn't need. Tight walls, good insulation, a wood stove that would handle a Kentucky winter, a covered porch from which I could see the hollow below and the ridge above. Abe Wheeler came to dinner the first night I cooked in that house. We ate at a simple wooden table, and it was the best meal I have ever had, and neither of us needed to say why. I also made an agreement with Raymond. It wasn't a complicated one. The development sale of the back 80 acres was halted pending a complete environmental review that addressed the watershed adequately. I was willing to consent to eventual development if the review was satisfactory, and I told Raymond this directly. I had no interest in holding that easement as a permanent veto. I had an interest in the spring being protected, because the spring was what made the hollow what it was. That was all my grandfather had ever asked of it, to be understood for what it actually was, rather than dismissed for what it appeared to be. Raymond accepted this with the relieved dignity of a man who had been bracing for something much worse, and found it wasn't as bad as he'd feared. Diane accepted it in particular silence of someone who has reconsidered their position and decided not to announce the reconsidering. That was the best I could expect from her, and it was enough. Marcus called me in April. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to meet for coffee. I said yes. We met at a diner in the county seat, the kind of place with bad lighting and good pie. He was in the middle of his junior year, studying land and resource management. He had changed his major in January. He'd driven 2 hours to tell me that in person, which I respected. We talked for a long time. Not about the courthouse meeting, not about the documents, not about the easement or the mineral rights. We talked about the land. He had questions, real ones, the kind that come from someone who has started paying attention. He asked about the soil composition of the hollow. He asked about the hardwood management timeline. He asked carefully if there was any role he could play. I thought about my grandfather, about the fence line and the long silences, and the way he had offered me everything he knew through proximity and patience rather than declaration. I told Marcus, "Come walk the hollow with me. Bring questions. We'll see." He came the following Saturday. We walked for 3 hours. He had good questions. He didn't pretend to know things he didn't know, which was new, and it was the quality I most needed him to have. We kept walking after that. Not every week, but regularly. The education was slow and real, which is the only kind that takes. Abe Wheeler turned 75 in June. We had a small gathering at the edge of the hollow. Just a few people who knew the story. Abe, Frank Coble, Dale Mercer's son. 2 neighbors who'd known my grandfather. I cooked over an open fire the way my grandfather had shown me, years ago on another part of the same land. The smoke rose straight up in the still evening air, and the hollow held it for a while, the way the hollow holds everything. Someone asked me, that evening, what I was going to do with all of it. I thought about it for a while before I answered. Farm it, I said. The upper ground, in time, if Raymond's willing to work something out. Manage the timber on the eastern ridge. Let the gas company do their work and protect the water. Stay. That's it? They asked. That's everything, I said. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. Don't forget to subscribe and check out the other stories on screen right now.